Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the MSU Extension Field Crops Team Virtual Breakfast. My name is Jim Islib. I'm an Extension educator and hosting the virtual breakfast this morning. Today's speakers are Dr. Erin Burns and Dr. Jeff Andreessen. Dr. Burns will talk about post-emergence weed control issues, followed by Dr. Andreessen's weekly ag weather report. And your questions are welcome. We'd like you to type them into the chat box on your screen, and we'll address them at the end of each of the talks. Also, details regarding MDARD pesticide applicator recertification credits are posted or will be posted in the chat box, and live participation in 2 of these virtual breakfast programs will earn you 1 credit in private or commercial core or commercial category 1A or field crops. And with that, I want to turn it over to Dr. Erin Burns.
All right, thanks, Jim, and thank you, everyone, for joining us this Thursday morning. I know the sun is shining, and it's pretty nice out there. So this morning, I'm going to cover some topics to think about as we're making some of our post-emergence weed applications in the upcoming weeks. And in order to have a conversation about weed control, we have to remind ourselves about the weed seed inputs from 2019. So on the screen right now, I have 3 different pictures of fairly weedy fields last fall, and we know that 2019 was a pretty difficult season for many growers, and there were a lot of weed escapes in fields throughout the state. And many of these weeds produced quite a few new weed seeds that went into the weed seed bank that we're going to be battling this upcoming year. So keeping 2019 in mind, we're going to really start talking about what some of our approaches will be and how they might be a little bit different compared to optimal years. So weed control programs have 2 major goals in general. The first are short-range goals, and these are the goals that we think of day to day when we're deciding how to manage weeds. And that's to protect crop yield. So to protect yield within the season and ensure that we have that maximum yield capacity that we're looking for. But the second, what I would consider sometimes the more important goal, is the long-range goal to deplete the weed seed bank. And this is especially important following these difficult seasons. Is first we want to preserve that short-term yield, 2020 yield, but we also want to deplete the new weed seed inputs for 2019. So a good weed control program can have those long-range implications on depleting those new weed inputs from difficult years and make weed control in following years much more easy. Thus, a comprehensive program would have 3 main elements. The first 2 elements have to do with pre-emergence herbicide or practices, and these were covered by Dr. Christy Sprague in the first virtual breakfast we had a few weeks ago. So these include planting clean, so effective burndown or tillage operations, and then full rates of pre-emergence herbicides with residuals. And then today I'm going to talk about effective post-emergence herbicides, and I'm really going to focus on how we decide when to make those applications and things to consider, and then at the end give a few resources on particular herbicide programs that might be applicable to your farm. So the first element of when we're trying to make the decision of when to apply post-emergence herbicides, we have 2 things to think about. We have the weeds, and we have the crop. So to go over the weedy aspects, the first is weed height. And this is often what you might see on the herbicide label. So on the right side of your screen, I took a snapshot of a herbicide label in which we have a number of weed species and then different herbicide application rates and what the maximum height that those weeds could be controlled at. And keep in mind the height on the herbicide label is simply just the susceptibility to the herbicide. So in the orange boxes, I highlighted a few weeds that you might have on your farm or find interesting. And the first is horseweed or mare's tail. So if you applied 32 fluid ounces of this product, you could control 18-inch mare's tail, 20-inch common lamb's quarter, or 24-inch palmer and other pigweed species. So you might be thinking to yourself, 18, 20-inch weeds, those are pretty tall. And I would agree. And that's because the height on those herbicide labels doesn't really take into the consideration the competitive potential of weeds that would be that tall. So on the screen, I have 2 pictures. The top is corn plants growing with Palmer amaranth. That's 12 inches tall. And you can see there's a lot more competition. You might expect a bigger reduction on yield due to that competition for a longer duration and by those bigger plants, as opposed to we might expect less of a crop yield loss with the bottom picture with only 4-inch weeds that haven't been competing with the crop as long and aren't taking up as many resources as bigger weeds would be. So in looking at those herbicide labels, keeping in mind actually the competitive potential of how tall some of those weeds can be is important. And just to show some data that goes along with making those applications at different heights, this is a paper that's actually authored by quite a few people that have relationships to MSU, and a few of them are on the call today, and this was conducted throughout the Midwest on different corn yields, and there were some locations in Michigan, and what they looked at was the relationship between corn grain yield and then weed size at the time of post-application. And then they kept those fields weed-free the rest of the season. So this is just implications of early season weed control on corn grain yield. And what they did was they applied a herbicide at 2, 4, 6, 9, or 12 inches after 12 inches tall, and then evaluated the implications on yield. And overall, what they found was when you apply a herbicide to 2-inch weeds, there was really no yield loss. 4-inch weeds, 3%, 6, 7%, 9, 10%, and then 12-inch weeds had a 21% yield reduction. And then if you just scale that out, if we went up to 14-inch weeds, we'd have 30.5%, and 16, almost a 40% yield reduction. So just showing how fast that line will dip as we have taller weeds that we're trying to control, and that early season impact on those tall weeds that are competing with your particular crop. Another element to consider when making post-emergence herbicide applications is weed growth rates. Often these weeds grow fairly slow initially, and then this is followed by rapid growth. So to give you an idea, for horseweed or mare's tail, we have individuals that are on the left that are either emerge in the fall or spring as rosettes, so those small circular plants that are more lower lying to the soil surface. And then this is followed by rapid stem elongation, which we term as bolting, and this rapid growth, which is the picture on your right. So being able to capture that phase and transition when making your post-emergence herbicide applications will help with herbicide efficacy. And also with some of our more aggressive pigweed species, such as water hemp or Palmer amaranth, we know these can grow quite quickly once the season gets going, upwards to 2.5 inches per day in some optimal scenarios. So timely scouting and knowing that these weeds can grow quite quickly once the season gets going will help making those decisions on when to apply those herbicides. The second element is the crop aspect of making post-emergence herbicide applications. So the stage or height first has implications on the crop tolerance to that particular herbicide. And this is often on the herbicide label. Also, I put up a snapshot of our weed control guide in which we have the maximum stage or height. So this is for the corn section, but is applicable to it's in other sections of when you can make those herbicide applications. So knowing what is the maximum stage that you can do that. And often we don't want to wait till that maximum stage because of the weed control that I talked about in the beginning, but also herbicides with any kind of significant residual activity. So once again, this is from the weed control guide and a photo of the crop rotation restrictions. You can see there's a large number of herbicides that we use that might have carryover potential into our desired crop the next year. So keeping in mind post-emergence timing to ensure that whatever you are growing in the following year can still be planted on time. And another aspect of making post-emergence herbicide applications, this is applicable to soybeans, is the new oxinic technologies that we have with Extend Beans or Enlist E3, and that's the cutoffs of when we can apply some of these herbicides over the top to these beans. So if you're applying any kind of registered dicamba products, you can apply these up to R1 soybeans or 45 days after soybean planting. And the important part is this is whatever comes first. So we had some early planted soybeans, so you'll want to be thinking about this if you are using that technology. And then 2,4-D choline can be applied up to R2 soybeans. So keeping in mind these are particular restrictions just applicable to some of those soybean trait technologies. And often when we're thinking about crop stage, this fails to consider weed emergence timing and also infestation in your field. And weeds can emerge either before your crop, so this can cause significant yield reductions by the time the crop reaches that targeted growth stage. So important to plant into weed-free fields, or if you did plant into weedy fields, knowing that you may need to apply some of those herbicides a little bit earlier. Or weeds can emerge after the crop. So this can lead to you applying that post-emergence herbicide before that major weed flush, after the crop and after our pre-emergence herbicide has broken. So this is important to keep in mind, that we're not applying those post-emergence herbicides too early if we did have an effective pre-down, to ensure that we're getting those later emergence weeds with our post-emergence application. And then just to touch on two environmental parameters that happened within the past few weeks. The first are the heavy rains that we experienced in a few parts of the state, and this will lead to crop plants being stressed, and they'll have that reduced compatibility both with any of the weeds that are up, so those weeds will have continue to grow and potentially have implications on yield. And overall, we want to avoid applying any kind of herbicide to a stressed crop, and that's because crop plants, how they survive that herbicide application is they metabolize that herbicide into non-toxic compounds. So when crops are stressed, they don't metabolize quite as quickly, and that's when you will see that crop damage. This is also applicable to cold weather, which we also had within the past few weeks. So temperatures following that herbicide application will determine crop safety and both weed control efficacy. And once again, plant metabolism is slowed during those cool, cold conditions. So those plants aren't growing quite as rapidly, and they're not degrading that herbicide. Therefore, they're going to potentially see some implications on that. And also the same goes with weeds. So we want to control those weeds. If they're not growing as well and as rapidly, you might see a reduction in weed control than what you would normally expect. So two implications if we made herbicide applications right after those rains, or in colder weather. I'm just going to show two slides about herbicide recommendations, and then give you some resources of where to go find those, since we have a short snippet of time. And the first is looking at just pigweed, or so palmer and water hemp control in various crops. The bottom left of the screen has a picture of this fact sheet, which is on our website, msuweeds.com, and I will put this in the chat box when I'm done talking. So this is looking at palmer wood or water hemp control in corn. So we'd recommend applying those to 3-inch tall weeds, and that you need 2 effective post herbicide sites of action for control. So in this fact sheet, I've put together a number of different herbicides that are effective at control of both these pigweed species, and then the timing that you can apply those. So just wanted to let you know that this was a resource that we had on our website. And then also for soybeans, we often get questions about mare's tail or horseweed control on soybeans, and your post-emergence options are largely going to be dictated by what soybean trait technology you decided to plant. And I just have a picture of the different soybean trait technologies that are available and what you can apply over the top. And also there's a great fact sheet that Dr. Christy Sprague put together about weed control of mare's tail that's also on our website. And then here's a photo of our website. So once again, msuweeds.com, which has our weed control guide and lots of other great information. So I'll put both these links into the chat box in a little bit.
Well, thanks very much, Erin. I want to remind everybody to check the chat box for information on receiving RUP credits for today's meeting, and also encourage you to put any questions that you have into the chat. We have a couple questions, Erin. Is there any documentation or resources for organic farming organizations within this similar topic, such as sprays that are approved by USDA, National Organic Program, and OMRI listing?
That's a great question. I don't believe that we have any on our website, but there's a great weeds team between our department and the horticulture department at MSU. So I'm sure we could find a website within that would have those resources for you.
Okay, another question. What is the status of all of our pre-emergence herbicides after all this rain?
Well, that's a good question. So it really depends on when you applied those pre-emergence herbicides and what soil texture you have and things like that. So we know in areas that got upwards of 4 or 5 inches of rain, we might think that those herbicides might have been moved down a little bit farther through the soil profile than what we'd like. We'd like to keep them within the top 2 inches because that's where the large majority of weed seeds are germinating and where those pre-emergence herbicides will be controlled. So if you did apply those pre's and then had those big rains, I would really make sure that you scout your fields a little bit earlier than normal to make sure that you're going to see any of those weed breaks on time.
Thank you. There's one last question. I don't know if this falls into your bailiwick. Is there any data showing the yield impacts of cover crop termination timing in no-till corn systems?
Well, I'm sure there is.
Okay.
I know for soybean, Christy Sprague had a graduate student who did a great project looking at termination, and also Dr. Erin Hill has done a lot of work. So we do have some of those fact sheets. And on the corn side, I'd have to look for some of those resources.
Thanks, Erin. What, if anything, will be the fallout of the cold weather on the effectiveness of post-emergence herbicide weed control?
I mean, once again, so depending on how cold it was when you made those post applications, potentially, I mean, if the weeds aren't growing, actively growing, many of our herbicides that need to move throughout the plant don't move throughout the plant as well, so that you don't see the weed control you expect, or it might take a little bit longer to get the control to actually kill those weeds. And then just on the crop side, you may see some injury, but I'd be more worried about the saturated conditions than the cooler conditions on that one. So I guess hopefully most places in the state, you weren't making those post-emergence herbicide applications during those cold times. It'd probably be more of those pre's. But yeah, just keep an eye on those.
Okay, if you had a choice, what would you plant? Here we go. Dicamba or Liberty Link beans?
I saw that one. I mean, it's whatever that you find fit for your farm and your field and what kind of weed spectrum you have. So they both provide post-emergence options for the herbicide-resistant weeds we have in the state. And it just depends on kind of let's say how aggressive your weeds are in your field, and then if you're applying your own herbicides or getting it done commercially and different things like that. So I think they both provide excellent options for weed control. And if you look at those fact sheets, we have the different parameters and restrictions outlined if you do decide to apply dicamba over the top of those extend beans. So just keep in mind looking at those also when you're making those decisions.
Thanks. And we have a couple of resources that have been posted in the chat box. Dr. Chris DeFonso has put in a link to research on cover crops, horseweed in soybeans, including yield data. It's available as a video on AgFacts, so there's a link there in the chat for that. And Dr. Burns has also put in a link to fact sheets on the msuweeds.com website. Charles mentions, as for the question of dicamba versus Liberty beans, don't forget E3 beans that give you Liberty plus 2,4-D options.
I wondered if I might have just a quick second to remind some folks down here in the Southwest about, the question on dicamba or 2,4-D versus Liberty Link. It's really kind of important to also look at the crops, the vulnerable crops that are close by to those fields. And so with fruit and sometimes vegetables, we may have some situations where Liberty has a little bit better opportunity to be safer. So that's just kind of one thing that should be considered in that process, I believe, too.
It's 7:34 by my clock, and we're done with our virtual breakfast for this week. We will stay on for a few minutes in case there's any final questions. So thanks very much for joining us today.